Let's talk about how accrual accounting opens the door to revenue manipulation. And although this may be a little early to talk about revenue manipulation, I think now that we have the basic framework, accrual accounting, it's important to note that accrual accounting does have flaws. And the flaws are that companies can manipulate their earnings and their revenue. So let's talk about that. The wiggle room is created because revenue recognition is not black and white. You can recognize there are going to be many circumstances in which companies, based on the assessment of what counts as a completed deliverable, or what is the value, in the Apple's example, what is the value of the software rights in the future, the software upgrades rights in the future, that $25 that we talked about, that required a lot of subjective assessments. And so that wiggle room is created and allows for manipulation in the form of really essentially shifting revenues from one period to another. And while the revenue recognition methods, like in the Apple example, are really always explained, almost always explained in the company's 10K footnotes, when there's suspicion of shenanigans, you want to read those carefully. And so let's talk about a well-known example that happened where revenues were manipulated. So TSAI was a company that was a software maker, and what they did was they changed their revenue recognition approaches to mask falling revenues. And this is how they did it. They sold 5-year license agreements for its software, and up until 1998, they employed very conservative revenue recognition practices. They would only record revenues from agreements when the customers were billed through the course of the 5-year agreement. And so investors understood that this is how they run things. So from a comparable standpoint, they could look at 1996 compared to 1997, compared to 1998, and they would understand that this is the consistent practice of revenue recognition. So if they recognize a certain revenue growth rate, they would understand that at least the revenue recognition is consistent. But when in 1998, TSAI began experiencing slowing sales, they decided an easy way to hide the problem from investors is to simply change its revenue recognition practices. And now, instead of waiting to recognize revenue as the customers were billed through the course of the 5-year agreement, that's when they originally recognized revenue. But instead of doing that, they decided to change their practice to a very aggressive revenue recognition policy where they recorded nearly 5 years worth of revenues up front. So if they sold something, they sold a 5-year license, they would recognize all the revenue associated with it up front instead of distributing it evenly over 5 years. And of course, in that very first year, 1998, that led to an artificial boosting of sales. 1998 didn't look that bad anymore. But since now they've switched to revenue recognition rules that are much more aggressive, they couldn't switch back to the more conservative rules in 1999. So in the following year, they had to maintain those same aggressive rules, but sales were still declining. And now investors, a year later, had an apples-to-apples comparison, a 1999 versus a 1998, using the same, now more aggressive revenue recognition rules, and they saw a 20% decline in revenue. So they were able to mask it for 1 year. Presumably, they figured that they would turn things around, but when they didn't, that's when the problem was exposed broadly to everybody.